Good evening. I've hyped it up probably more than I've ever hyped up something in front of a camera in my entire life. But tonight is finally the night. See, unfortunately for you all, and fortunately for me, I have finally amassed the resources necessary to start making the videos that I really want to make, the ones I've wanted to make for years. And tonight, on your very screen, you are beholding one such video. We are going to take a look at the inherent connections between music and video games as tactile and experiential forms of art, both of them. And we're going to do it by looking at a dynamic that's as old as art itself. The relationship between popular opinion, criticism, originality, and art. We're going to ask a lot of big questions, and I'm going to try and give a lot of big answers, but please bear one thing in mind before we start. Number one, facts are facts, history is history. We're going to be talking about both. But aside from that, the conclusions that I'm going to draw are my own, and I urge you to draw your own as well. And number two, even though we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff, a lot of different types of games, a lot of styles of music, covering a very wide swath of history, through it all, our one guiding thread is going to be what we talked about last time, right? Open world games, their supposed oversaturation by popular demand, critical fatigue. We're going to be taking a look. Why is that? What resulted in that happening? And have open world games really outlived their usefulness? Is it time for them to die? Have we moved past that point? By the end of these 2 episodes, I'm gonna have my answer, and you might have yours too. But before we jump right into things, we are gonna take a look at what we talked about last time, just as a quick refresher. Let's get into it.
Everybody's gone to bed and sleep and we're up all night. Instead, games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present creative soliloquies. Everybody's gone to bed and sleep and we're up all night. Instead, games and movies are our sweet reveries. We present creative soliloquies.
So now, it's time for the ultimate question. Not because it's the only question that we're going to pose and then attempt to answer, but because it's going to serve as a segue from our last episode into these next couple. What makes an open world game worth it? Is there an X factor that justifies a game designer putting the player through potentially hundreds of hours of a single gameplay experience? The answer to that might reside in what is probably the singular worst consequence of the pitfalls we talked about last time. When people debate the merits of open world versus linearity, somebody will inevitably bring up padding, which is what it sounds like. It's fluff that gets added to make a game bigger and longer, that ultimately contributes nothing of unique or meaningful value. Cookie cutter quests, undiscovered locations with nothing interesting in them, video game busy work. I've heard people describe lazy open worlds as a linear campaign that just takes longer to play through. And I thought that was a really interesting take because aside from revisiting locations, what really, fundamentally, makes a narrative game staged in an open world different from one staged linearly? Going off that logic, many open worlds are just padded out linear campaigns, and that's crazy to think about because if it's centered on a story, you're still going through events. You still gotta go to them in a specific order, like in a linear game. But like many things in gaming, what qualifies as padding is often subjective. The big advantage of an open world is being able to freely explore it, but what makes that exploration substantial? Is it the size of the world, or how pretty it is, or how much there is to do, how many things to find, whether they're unique or not? The popularity of games like Valhalla or Ghost of Tsushima suggests that these things do sway some gamers, but the very nature of criticism says that popularity isn't a determinant in artistic worth. Whether or not it should be is another discussion entirely. Every so often, critical and popular opinion will align, but they clash just as often. Perfect example, all the people who were upset at the lack of Oscar noms for No Way Home, right? I mean, if you were a devoted Spidey fan who had seen all 7 theatrical films prior that built up into that one, or even if you'd just seen the Tom Holland movies and had heard about the others tangentially, you probably really enjoyed that movie. as I did, as my friends did. But let's not pretend like it was a masterpiece of storytelling or cinematography, let alone the best movie that came out that year. It was a good, solid Spider-Man film, but the best movie of the year? And then Sam Jack, my Morehouse brother, who I love, came out in defense of it and said that the popularity of the movie meant that it warranted consideration. But to acknowledge that as true would be to acknowledge that awards shows are basically popularity contests. Which they kind of are, so maybe he had a point.
Tsushima itself is another great example. Beautiful graphics, great soundtrack, fluid, satisfying combat, a simple but really powerful story. It won a lot of hearts. It was the popular choice for Game of the Year back then. And yet, personally, I didn't love it because it's this huge world that's just boring. And I think a lot of folks are afraid to admit that, but search your feelings. You know it to be true. You do. Ghost can have its strengths even if you admit this one weakness. Once you've composed your first haiku, followed your first fox, rescued your first hostage, defeated your first Mongol leader, executed your first bamboo strike, you've seen 90% of what there is to see. Because the rest of the game is just increasingly challenging palette swaps of the same thing. The game is padded to the max. Of the 50 hours I spent with it, maybe 10 to 15 of that was unique gameplay. But see, here's where subjectivity comes in. Padding in games like Ghost doesn't deter fans from enjoying them, because even though objectively it's lacking a lot of what makes something like Breath of the Wild interesting, subjectively, people who love the game don't give a shit. They love it for its characters, combat, narrative, and picturesque cinematic presentation. Not to mention, the whole thing is an epic samurai film that you play through, done in homage to Akira Kurosawa. So, the whole format of riding through a beautiful, empty landscape on the way to the next town to save might not be the most innovative game design, but it's completely aesthetically and thematically appropriate. It's not exactly creative, but it's fun, and it still succeeded. Now, looking at what actually won Game of the Year, The Last of Us 2 was one of the best and most creative demonstrations ever of what makes the gaming medium unique, and how to use that uniqueness to tell a story in a way that only a game could. But its popular reception was rife with controversy. I could fill a whole different video with dumb shit that was said in the discourse around that game. I just might sometime.
Ghost versus Last of Us 2 is actually the perfect encapsulation of what we've talked about so far. On the one hand, you've got an extremely popular open world game, superficially gorgeous, and yet not all that creative, and some critics took issue with that. On the other hand, those same critics lauded The Last of Us, which took a lot of really interesting risks that paid off, but some gamers took issue with it. There's always going to be some overlap, but popular opinion and criticism will always be locked in this sort of perpetual sparring match.
Art and criticism are two sides of the same coin, locked in an eternal dance that's come to define many aspects of human history across various creative mediums. I don't love criticism, but I understand the societal function of it. Just because something is popular doesn't necessarily mean it's good or of substance. And the older I got, the less I thought about criticism as telling people what they should think, and the more I think about it as critics pushing creators to try and do more. Now, obviously some critics are snobbish egomaniacs, but those are often the ones whose actual knowledge of their subject matter is pretty dicey. And at the end of the day, nobody will ever universally agree about art and entertainment. And that's the one thing we all can agree on. There's no such thing as an objectively correct way to make a work of art. But in the end, the things that have worked will continue to work. And while they do so, the hope is that art naturally trends towards novel, exciting, quality output. And a critical component in that, at least in theory, is good, informed criticism that constructively pushes artists.
All art is inherently different. There's no right or wrong way to make a work of art, and so therefore good criticism isn't going to be based on right or wrong, it's going to be based on good or bad. So, bearing that in mind, let's get a little bit philosophical. What is bad art? The other week I had a conversation with a total stranger online about an article that I think the title of it was something like How to Tell Good Acting from Bad Acting. And I commented on it. I was like, well, there's no way in the world that you're ever going to write a definitive treatise on something like this. It's art. It's subjective. It's going to depend entirely on the individual. And a person responded to me. She was like, well, no, there's a whole branch of philosophy dealing with objectivity in art, or at least attempted objectivity, called aesthetics. And I was like, yeah, I know. Where the idea of it is that you can look at the quality, the craftsmanship of something and appreciate it on an objective level based on how well it was made. And that's absolutely true. There's plenty of games that I've talked about on this channel that I don't necessarily like or love, but I appreciate the craftsmanship of them. But even that comes down to personal taste. Not everybody's going to think that the same things are well made. The moral of that story is, art is always going to have a degree of subjectivity, no matter how you want to spin it. People have been trying to define art completely objectively for centuries. It's just not possible. It's just not going to happen. And that's why I say that criticism is less about telling you what to think and more about trying to push artists to be their best selves, you know? So when Ubisoft comes out with another game that doesn't make anything new, and they make a shit ton of money off of it, and it gets 7s and 8s from reviewers, that's why, you know, some alternative reviewers like Dunkey, who I've mentioned on this channel before, get so pissed about it. Because those 7s and 8s aren't going to push anyone to do anything differently. And the frustration with mainstream game discourse centers on that desire for ingenuity and creativity, you know? But when we look at all these different games, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Far Cry, Horizon, Elden Ring, Breath of the Wild, Biomutant, Ghost of Tsushima, they've all got these massive fan bases that are really enjoying those offerings, you know? Even though they span a pretty wide variety of gameplay flavors and, yes, quality, right? So to answer our first big question, there's no X factor when it comes to consumers. Whatever you want to put out, there is always going to be somebody that's going to enjoy it. But while there may not be an X factor with consumers, I'd say there definitely is one in critical art circles. And that, my friends, is originality.
Our next big question: does originality inherently make something more valuable? And here's where, finally, I'm going to bring my other great passion into the discussion: music. Now, we're bringing music into the conversation for two reasons. One, I'm a musician, so it's what I know. And two, music and games have a lot more in common than you might think. As experiential and tactile forms of art, they are mediums in which people create experiences for others in a process requiring skill that are then engaged with in a tactile manner, during which others can observe and appreciate. Not to mention, we use the word play as the verb describing engagement with both. Let's start with Western tradition, which, for those who don't know, is what's more commonly referred to as classical, which most people recognize as sounds from the medieval period all the way up through the 20th century. Quick disclaimer: the phrase "for those who don't know" is not meant to be patronizing in any way and literally just is meant to inform on things I bring up that aren't necessarily general knowledge. Anyhow, Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, Liszt, Berlioz, Brahms, Debussy, a million other dead Europeans that I could name, right? They all wrote the music they felt. Critics published their takes, artists did new things, sensibilities evolved, and the whole cycle repeated. But in the 20th century, partially fueled by the massive societal shift of the Industrial Revolution, there was a shift in thinking that resulted in this entirely new genre called serialism, a music that was based on abstract systems that reduced music and harmony and notes down to numbers before running them through systems that would then turn out melodies in these weird permutations that human ears probably wouldn't naturally think of. There were many other styles that popped up in 20th century Europe, some of which were actually pretty cool, but because it was novel, serialism was the new hot thing at the time among composers. If serialism doesn't sound like it's fun to listen to, that's because it isn't. Not conventionally, anyhow. And because of that, it was never really popular. It was essentially a massive collective artist experiment.
Fast forward to the modern day, when people look down on others for liking pop music because their favorite genre of music is so superior, pop music isn't original, or all sounds the same. That is hilarious to me, because I promise you, at one point, someone was calling your favorite genre popular crap also, and someone is currently saying that it all sounds the same. It's okay to not like certain types of music, obviously, we all have tastes, but don't look down on somebody, it doesn't make any sense. And this is part of why the distinction that gets made between high art and popular art is so goddamn stupid to me. Because historically, there's a lot of overlap between the two. I hate those terms, but I have to use them sometimes so that people know what I'm talking about. But anyhow, there's more ways to make your work original than just doing something completely avant-garde anyway. Example incoming.
And speaking of genres and originality, think about what a genre is. Regarding games, whether it's a platformer, shooter, puzzle game, survival horror, action, adventure, role-playing, action role-playing, immersive sim, you get the idea. By definition, when you make something in a genre, you're riffing off of something else that's already been done. And the reason I say that is because when people complain about a lack of originality, one of the most common counter-arguments that comes up is the idea that everything has already been done. When we think of the freest, most critically acclaimed, most intuitive games of the past years, like Zelda, like Dishonored, like Hitman, we think of them as their own unique experiences, even though they're built off of something that came before. Fun fact, when Beethoven wrote his Ninth Symphony, people legitimately thought that music as a medium was done forever. He seamlessly combined vocal and symphonic flavors, resulting in one of the most popular pieces ever. But when it comes to art, taste and complexity aren't the same thing. The Blue Danube, which if you've heard it, which you definitely have, is a relatively simple waltz, but it was one of the first post-Ninth Symphony pieces to prove that, with creativity, good music could still be written. Sure, there's nothing new under the sun, but that's not really true, is it? Because the history of art is the history of taking the old, the played out, the forgotten, or otherwise unappreciated things and making them new again. So to put all this in a nutshell, even though serialism and 12-tone music had interesting esoteric implications, its abstraction of the creative process obviously didn't make it more inherently valuable than the conventionally pleasant sounds of some of the music written in the 18th and 19th centuries. Especially since you've heard of Bach, but you might not have heard of Barry.
So even though our last big question was a yes or no, the answer isn't quite so simple, is it? Because serialism demonstrates to us that novelty isn't always a factor in the value of a work outside of artistic circles, but the Blue Danube demonstrates to us that even if a work isn't totally new or doesn't completely reinvent the wheel, good old-fashioned creativity and artistic taste are tried and true variables in the reception of a work as, fresh and exciting. So to put a nice pretty bow on our conversation, right? In my opinion, originality is a factor in the value of a work of art, just so long as that originality doesn't forsake good artistic taste in the pursuit of it. If there's one absolute in the art world, it's that nobody can force the tides of taste to change. More on that next time. But anyhow, in a commitment to making these videos a more reasonable length so that you all will sit through them, we're going to end things right here, and we're going to pick up next time for part 2. See ya.